Alright, well this is the last episode in sort of our progress here on tanning these rabbit hides. It's been a bit of a process, but we have some results. And we've also had some really good questions, so sort of stay tuned and we're going to answer some of those too as part of this video. We are now basically done. I'll bring up a fur here. We have them all broke, and as you can see here on this one, it's fairly pliable still, which is quite nice. Now we have found there is some difference between the different hides. Some are a little more paperier than others, and a lot of that does have to do, I think we showed this before, but this is the belly. There are these thinner areas. So on some of them, those are more papery, or areas like this that are harder to work around the neck. Kind of bottom line with this, you are going to have, I'm not going to call it waste, but you're going to have pieces that you probably can't make into something. And that's okay, because this is kind of a byproduct from raising rabbits, which any byproduct you can get out of any endeavor you're doing and make it into something valuable is useful. So we've got in front of us a couple of different things to show you. First, we wanted to show you, even though we hadn't talked about this, we wanted to show you what we've done with egg tanning. So these two pelts here, we actually did last year, and I'll open them up here, and I'll show you. They are, this is an egg tanned one, and this is one that we've tanned with the aluminum sulfate. And you can see there's a big difference in color. Now, I think we mentioned it already, but when we did the egg tanning, we liked the result. It made a really nice fur, but we were having a bit of difficulty with consistency, and some of that could have been error on our part. That was a really big difference we found between the egg tanning and the basically the alum tanning with the aluminum sulfate, is we got a much more consistent product out of these. And when you're busy doing a lot of other stuff, not that busy is an excuse, but it's nice to have something that you can kind of leave it and forget about it and is a little more forgiving. So we definitely like the end result here. As you can see, it's a very nice nice hide basically. But we do like the ability to kind of leave it and forget it a little bit with the alum tanning. Now, one thing I'll say here too, with both of these methods, they're not waterproof. So you go through the tanning process, and if you were just going to tan it and put it on a wall, say with what you might do with like a fox fur or something, it's preserved, but it won't wear well over time unless you waterproof it. And there are different ways to do that. For this round, what we've done is we actually use a neat's foot oil on these egg tanned ones, which is kind of part of what's caused the color, in addition to the egg, obviously. But in these ones, we actually used a mink oil. And we still have to do some working on this particular one, but you can see the mink oil doesn't discolor it as much. So far, we're kind of liking the mink oil a little better, but that'll be, we'll come back to that and see what we think of it in the long run. But you do have to be careful, because they won't last long term if you don't waterproof them somehow. You can also do additional tans like veg tanning, which we don't know a lot about, but that's something we may look into in the future. So kind of going back to the furs that we've tanned this time around, you can see these ones we've worked, but we haven't applied the mink oil to them yet, and most of these have actually stayed quite supple. We did have a couple. This one in particular, I don't know if you can hear it. You hear that noise? That's what we mean when we talk about papery. This particular rabbit hide seemed to just kind of go that way. It didn't go as nicely. We're just going to put it that way. And there could be some various reasons for that. I think that's one thing about the tanning process that you want to remind yourself about if you're doing it with your meat rabbits, is they may not all turn out perfectly. Now there are things you can do to help that situation, but it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. You're getting some value addedness out of what would be a waste product. But this one here, you can see we've applied the mink oil, and we've basically turned the hide back the proper way, and you can see it's still quite pliable, which is great. We're going to store these leather side in, because we think that'll keep them better, basically, in the short term. Yeah, that's basically what we end up with. And we're going to have to next figure out what we're going to do with them. Now, as part of this, we got some really good questions from people in comments in the other videos. So we want to take a moment to sort of answer some of those. One question we had was, what month is a good month basically to harvest the rabbits for their pelts? Now, one thing to keep in mind with rabbit pelts, if you're growing them for meat when you're raising basically fryers, so around the 5-pound mark, 12-ish weeks of age, those fryers won't have as nice of a pelt, and it has a lot to do with the thickness of the hide. It is still usable. You can still use it for crafting purposes if you just want some rabbit trim, etc. But if you were going to, say, make a rabbit fur coat, which I don't know if you would do that or not, but if you were going to do something more substantial, it probably wouldn't last well. And that's going to go down a lot to the thickness of the hide. As the rabbit gets older, the hide gets thicker. So when they're young rabbits like that, they're quite a thin hide on them. And even though this wasn't a young rabbit, you will get these thin skins that they're very hard to work really well. You're probably going to end up with a little bit of paperiness to it. That doesn't mean you can't still use it, but it's not likely ideal. Another thing to consider, depending on where you are in the world, if you're in a colder climate and your rabbits are exposed to kind of a colder season, they're probably going to be in sort of their prime in those colder months. Now for us, I'm going to kind of use this on a bit historical data, but typically if you were harvesting fur bearers, wild fur bearers, you're kind of looking from sort of mid-October to early March. And that's usually, and it varies by species, but that's kind of your period where they're in their best fur because those are the coldest months, or lead up to the coldest months. And that's going to be the same case with the rabbits. Now, for us, we do find December's a great month, partially because there's less going on, and we're kind of at the end of our quote-unquote nice growing season. December is when we finally get winter, and so it's a good time to kind of go through and do these selections to save these furs. Another really good question was about age, and that's a bit subjective because, like I said before, those fryers are not going to be necessarily ideal. Still usable, but not ideal. And you might have a harder time working with them because they're thinner. You're probably looking for a rabbit somewhere between 4.5 months is probably the earliest. At that point, at 4.5 months, that's roughly 18 to 20 weeks each, give or take. That's kind of a compromise, right? You haven't fed them for a long period of time. They haven't grown a really thick adult hide yet, but it's thick enough that it'll work well. And we definitely found that with these rabbits. Although they varied in age, you could see that with the younger set that we did. Now, that being said, you can harvest kind of your ex-breeders, that sort of thing, when you cull them from the herd, as long as you're doing it in a month that's good for the pelt, and there's a few other things to consider there. They'll make really nice pelts because they'll have very thick hide, maybe even a little harder to work with. Even though rabbit is notorious for being thin-skinned, some of those older rabbits, they've got pretty thick skin compared to their wild counterparts. So that's just something to think about, right? This age is not really a limiting factor. They can be quite a bit older, but you've got to balance, are you doing it as an extra, or is that your principal? If it's your principal, you're probably not going to grow them out for 2 or 3 years, but if you're doing it as an extra, then it doesn't matter because you've used them for breeders and that sort of thing. As far as looking at trying to maximize getting a really good pelt, there are a few things to look at. One was the molt sequence, because that could be a little different, even though, like I'm saying, that December for us is a really good time because the vast majority of them have molted into their winter fur. You can still get some variation. One thing we did notice is does that have recently, but that haven't had enough time to sort of complete a molt after having young, sometimes have patches where there's more blood flow. We showed that in one of the previous videos. But even some of the younger rabbits can have that, and you may see that on your hides. Those areas you may get slippage of the hair. And as long as it's not a substantial part of the fur, and I don't know if I have one here that really shows it, but like this one, it's quite uniform. It didn't really have any of those kind of noticeable blood flow areas, and you've got no slippage. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Another thing about sort of maximizing is kind of the handling of the hide. If you, and you probably wouldn't do this necessarily, but if you were harvesting them in a hot month, even if they were the right age that they should be done, some of their molts, you don't want to leave those hides laying around in the sun for hours on end, because if you start to get any kind of green areas and some decay in that hide, that can affect your fur quality as well. You can get slippage and that sort of thing. Obviously, that's another great advantage to doing it late in December when the temperatures are quite cold, is you don't get that same quickness to go bad or to rot, natural decay that you would get in, say, July. So that's something to consider. One thing we did find too is we may have on a few of these hides let them dry out too much. I've not really read about that extensively, but if you're going to freeze them, you probably want to do it fairly quickly. You put them in the freezer, and you want to do them first side out. It's just something that we've noticed, because the hide and the flesh can dry out too much, and that can make it a little harder to work with. We actually did have one hide that, because we had left them out in the woodshed for far too long, we weren't able to work with it. It wouldn't flesh well, so we just weren't able to complete that. So there are little handling things to keep in mind. But all in all, at the end of this experiment, we would definitely say it's worthwhile. We're fairly impressed with the product that comes out of it. We still have some things to learn about it. I think that'll probably be an ongoing thing. There's always something to learn. You can always get better. At the same time, when we're doing this mostly for our own use, you can accept a few little defects. Like this one here has a cut mark in it. That's not optimal because that's on the back, but we can still make use of this. If you were trying to do this to sell, you would probably have to do a lot of tanning to get to the point that you're consistent enough to sort of supply good pelts, because like everything else, once you take it to that level, there is a demand that you do it really well. It's almost done perfectly, right? And by no means are we suggesting that we have done this process perfectly, but we are pleasantly surprised and happy with the result. So we definitely recommend, if you're raising rabbits already, think about potentially trying to find ways that you could maybe save some of the hides to do this kind of tanning, because it's a little bit time consuming, but it's not that hard. And it's pretty accessible to everybody. So stay tuned, because at some point or other, we will be coming up with a use for these, aside from just being soft and looking pretty.